and welcome back. This is week 3 of our Bible study on Hosea. And today we're just going to talk about Israel's covenant relationship with the Lord, which was a marriage, and it was portrayed in Hosea's life as marriage to Gomer. And I'm reminded of a quote from R.C. Sproul in his book, What's in the Bible, where he says, just so you know, Hosea, just so you know what it feels like to be me, go marry someone who has no idea what faithfulness, loyalty, and fidelity mean. And so Hosea had the task of marrying Gomer and experiencing personally what it was like to be married to an unfaithful person. And in so doing, he would experience what it's like to be God dealing with a wayward people who continually departed from him. And so to set the stage a little bit further and establish the covenant language, I'd just like to take us to Exodus chapter 19 and the old covenant at Sinai, where God entered into a covenant relationship with his people. And this is Exodus 19. And if you just follow along with me for a couple of verses, verse 3, and we'll just establish some covenant language here that'll show this relationship from the outset. So then Moses, this is Exodus 19:3. So then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. And although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." And so Moses presented this to God's people, and they said, and they agreed to this covenant relationship. And if you flip over to chapter 24 of Exodus, and here's what we read in chapter 24, verse 3. Then Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, and they responded with one voice. Okay? "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." And Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. And he got up early the next morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered up burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. And they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." That's verse 7. Then he says, Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." And so thus we have the old covenant established, where Israel is now betrothed to the Lord as his special possession, a special covenant people. And you find this more than a metaphor, actually. It's a relationship. But you find this marriage metaphor throughout the Old Testament. And it shows up in places like Isaiah, who was a contemporary of Hosea. Only Isaiah, remember, was down in Jerusalem. But in Isaiah 5, for example, he talks in very relational language about Israel, this time being his vineyard. And listen to this language. So Isaiah 5:1, "I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted in it the choicest of vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut down cut out a winepress as well. And then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but they yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? And so you have, now this is Judah and Jerusalem, but God is describing this special relationship he has with his own people. This time the metaphor is as a vineyard. Well, in Isaiah, as I said, was a contemporary of Hosea. But then you have a few years later, say 130 years later, roughly, Ezekiel is prophesying, and he describes this relationship between Jerusalem and Israel and Jerusalem in terms of a wayward spouse. And so in Ezekiel 16, for example, I encourage you to read the entire chapter, but I'm just going to read a verse here. In Ezekiel 16, verse 8, later I passed by, this is God speaking, and I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, and I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness, and I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the Lord, the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. So there's Ezekiel describing this covenant marriage relationship with Israel. And then he goes on to talk about how Israel trusted in her beauty and failed to give God credit for her many blessings, but instead worshipped foreign gods and made foreign alliances with Assyria. Over in chapter 23, there's a similar, almost a parable of two sisters, Israel and Judah. And in Ezekiel 23 and verse 6, or verse 5, he describes, verse 4, the two sisters. The older was named Oholah, and her sister was Oholibah. And they were mine, and gave birth to sons and daughters. Oholah is Samaria, which is another name for Ephraim or northern Israel. And Oholibah is Jerusalem. Now, verse 5, Oholah engaged in prostitution while she was still mine, and she lusted after her lovers, the Assyrians. Warriors clothed in blue, governors and commanders, and all of them handsome young men, and mounted horsemen. She gave herself as a prostitute to all the elite of the Assyrians and defiled herself with all the idols of everyone she lusted after. And so Ezekiel 23 also, along with Ezekiel 16, describe this relationship, this marriage relationship between God and his people as one in which Israel was unfaithful in that covenant. And so Jeremiah also describes the same thing, but in Jeremiah chapter 3, it's instructive how all of these prophets have very similar accounts of what's going on here. But Jeremiah 3 and verses 6 and 8, during the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, have you seen what faithless Israel has done? Now this is the northern kingdom. What faithless Israel has done, she's gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all she would return to me, but she did not. And her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. So both Israel and Judah engaged in idolatry and went after foreign gods, foreign nations. And verse 8, I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. And then I saw her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear, because she also went out and committed adultery. Well, so there's Jeremiah describing the same thing that Ezekiel did and that Hosea did. And it's reminiscent isn't it, of the certificate of divorce that Jeremiah talks about. I gave her my certificate of divorce. Well, what did God say in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 9? He says, and you are not my people, and I am not your God. Hosea 1:9, God gives Israel a certificate of divorce. After she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord called him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. And so the relationship, the covenant marriage relationship, was ended at this point. And Hosea goes on to develop this theme. Well, we saw it in verse 1, or verse 2, Israel's unfaithfulness. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go and take to yourself an adulterous wife. That's verse 2. In chapter 2 and verse 5, what do we read? And Israel, their mother, has been unfaithful and conceived them, the children, in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers and give them my food and my water. And then verse 13 of the same chapter 2, I will punish her for the day she burned incense to the Baals, and she decked herself in rings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot. So Israel is supposed to be God's special possession, is a holy nation devoted to God, but Hosea said, but me she forgot. In chapter 6, verse 7, you get this again. Like Adam, they have broken the covenant. Like Adam, they have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me there. And then chapter 8 and verse 1, put a trumpet to your lips. An eagle is over the house of the Lord, because the people have broken my covenant. People have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. Well, this is the covenant that we read about first in Exodus chapter 19, right? This is the old covenant that they broke. And so God says, well, I gave him a certificate of divorce. And Hosea's third child is named Lo Ami, which means you're not my people anymore. And so it looks like all hope is lost, except Hosea gives us a glimmer of hope. Hosea tells us later on that there will be a day of renewal. In chapter 2 and verse 18 actually, let's just check that out. In that day, so a future time, there would be a renewal of this marriage relationship. In that day, I will make a covenant for them with beasts of the field and birds of the air and creatures that move on the ground, and bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. Well, it sounds like a future time of blessedness and peace. I will betroth you to me forever, verse 19. I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. And that just got to ring a bell, right? Because what did God name Hosea's second child, the daughter? Lo Ruhamah. I will have no compassion. No compassion. And here he says there's going to be a future day when there will be love and compassion. And I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will know the Lord, verse 20. Well, in chapter 14 of Hosea also, you get a promise of future salvation. But chapter 14, here's what Hosea says, verse 4, I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them, and I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily, like a cedar of Lebanon. He will send down his roots. Think about how precious the dew was in a sun-baked Middle Eastern land where you dry out, your skin is dry by the time you're 30, right? And moisture is a scarce commodity. And so dew is a precious thing because it brings life. And God says, I will, like the dew to Israel, he will blossom like a lily. So there's a promise in Hosea, despite the fact that there's going to be an end to the covenant and you're not my people, there's going to be a time when there's going to be a renewal and a future blessedness. Reminds me of what Jeremiah promised 130 years later, right? Jeremiah 31. This is how Jeremiah describes it. And Jeremiah says, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." There you go, right? There's the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Two separate kingdoms united in one covenant. "It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them." There you got Jeremiah drawing all these themes together, right? He says, he's referencing the covenant that was made at Sinai, and he's saying they broke that. And they broke it even though I was a husband to them. So you see all these threads coming together: covenant, marriage, and husband and wife. Israel's God's wife. God is the husband. "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel." Verse 33, "After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds, and I write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And no longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest." Isn't that just what we saw in Hosea chapter 2, where God says, "I will betroth you to me forever," verse 19. "I will betroth you in righteousness and justice, love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will know the Lord." You will know the Lord. So this idea that they thought they knew the Lord, they didn't, or they wouldn't have gone off in unfaithfulness. But God says, you will know the Lord. And here in Jeremiah 31, what does he say? Verse 34, "No longer will a man teach his neighbor or his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, and I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more." Well, that's Jeremiah 31, talking about making a new covenant with the house of Israel, where God would implant his Holy Spirit in them and write his law on their hearts, and that they would know him intuitively and intimately, and not have the law written on tablets of stone and them going through life thinking that they know him, but that God's law would be written on their hearts by his Holy Spirit, and they would know him because God indwells them. And so that Jeremiah 31, "I will be their God and they will be my people." A new covenant, a new relationship, a restoration of that broken relationship. So Hosea, a lot of judgment coming, a lot of doom and gloom, a certificate of divorce. "You are not my people, and I am not your God. I'll have no compassion." And yet there's a promise in Hosea also of a way in which God would restore that broken relationship and would once again be their God, and they would once again be his people. And there would be a new covenant. And the law, as opposed to the law of Moses, which was written on tablets of stone, in which the people agreed to back at Sinai, Exodus 19 and 24, this law would be written on our hearts. It would be ratified. It would be executed by the Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who would die in our place. And he would be the sacrifice who would make this covenant. And so when you read the New Testament and the Passover, Jesus talked about this. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is shed for you." So Jesus was instituting a new covenant, a new relationship between God and his people. And the way to have fellowship with God is through Jesus Christ and partake in that new covenant relationship. So Hosea's got a lot of great theology in it, doesn't it? Isn't it a wonderful book? And it's a book full of hope. It starts off with a lot of despair and broken relationships, and hopelessness, no compassion. You're not my people anymore. And it ends with the knowledge that God was not finished with them yet. God still had a plan for them. And I hope you can join us on Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock. Next time, we're going to talk about the word knowing. So, know, the word know, to know, shows up 14 times in Hosea. And whereas Hosea, that people thought they knew God, they didn't. But the promise is that when this relationship is restored, they will all know me. And just like Hosea chapter 2, 20, I think it was, says that, Jeremiah says that also in the new covenant, right? And how is it that we know God? How is it that we can know him? That's food for thought and for discussion next time. We'll leave you with that, and look forward to seeing you Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock downstairs. And barring that, you can join us on our little videos. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.